So in this video we're going to take a quick look at the Chrome DevTools and how they can be used for software testing. And this is the kind of September 2022 edition because the Chrome DevTools change all the time. So I'm just going to use the Pulper application, which you can find from my website eviltester.com/page/tools/thepulper. Click on the Heroku hosted version or wherever we're hosting at that point in time. Now the DevTools. The DevTools we can access by right-clicking and doing Inspect. And the easiest way to learn the DevTools is to just go from left to right and look at the features and functionality that's in here. The DevTools are notionally tools that are used for web developers, but we can use them as well as software testers. So when you first come in, this is what you're going to see. You're going to be on the Elements tab, and you're going to have the application over here on the left. So you think that the first thing we're going to look at is the Elements tab, but it's not, because the first thing we want to look at is this Selector. By clicking on that and hovering over things in the page, we'll see elements in the page selected and we can get some information about it. That's quite useful. But more useful is as I go through it, you can see on the right hand side that it's being highlighted in the Elements tab. And we'll cover why that's useful in a moment, because there's this secret button here that we always forget about. I think of this as the mobile view, but it's not. It's the toggle device toolbar view. And basically it lets me see what the application looks like in different resolutions. So when it's in responsive mode, I can resize this and change the size of the screen to see how it reacts. And you can see that the menu bar on the application is changing depending on what the window sizes. You can also see at the top here that it's showing me what the CSS selectors for the page are. So if there were multiple ones here, I could really change to them by clicking on it. And I can choose fairly standard device sizes by clicking on here. So other things I can do here is we can change the size of the view in the page if we want to, depending on what screen size we're working on. We can change the style of application. So is it a mobile device? Is it a mobile device that has not got touch controls? Is it a desktop type view? In which case it's going to act with the normal mouse controls. So normally on this I'll have mobile view because I'm probably trying to see what it looks like on mobile. I can throttle the network tier to see roughly how it performs under different speeds. And because it's a mobile device, we can rotate it. And we have various ways of deciding what we're going to see on the view here, and we can capture screenshots and full size. Now it might seem, wait a minute, all he's doing is just walking through the tools here and explaining what they are. And just anyone could do that. What we're going to do is we're going to look at how is this useful for testing. The reason I'm walking through here is because this is what you have to do periodically to see what new features have been added into Chrome. We didn't always have the ability to capture screenshots. One thing to point out, when I put this on a mobile device, say iPhone SE. This is not an iPhone SE. This is not trying to replicate the browser in an iPhone SE. What it's trying to replicate are the dimensions that we have when we're viewing the tool on an iPhone SE. And also, if I quickly jump over to the network tab, we'll see this. The browser is now telling the server that it is an iPhone. If I look in the request headers here, and we'll cover the network tab later on, I can see that it's now telling the server that I'm an iPhone. This is useful if your application in the server side is configured to respond differently with different headers. So if it renders something differently when you approach it with a mobile phone than a desktop, this can be useful. It's not emulating a mobile device, it's simulating to the server a mobile device, and it's showing us what it might look like at this resolution, but not necessarily the same rendering engine. So it's quite useful for quick tests, and certainly for doing CSS responsive layout testing. So if I toggle this off, now we're back in the Elements tab. Elements tab shows us the DOM, the Document Object Model, which is the web page that the browser is rendering. This is different potentially from the source that was received. Because when the browser reads the source, what it does is it fixes it. If you've got invalid source in here, you're missing out an H tag here, then it will add it in order to try and render it. So sometimes the source will be slightly different from the DOM view. Also, things may have been populated with JavaScript. And this is where we'll do a lot of our testing work, because we can observe the DOM, we can interrogate the DOM, we can go into it and expand it to see what's happening. We can see what hooks there might be. So I could automate this by searching for the ID, then clicking on this particular anchor. But this is also a really good way to learn HTML. If you're coming in here and you're seeing something you don't know what it is, what is an HR tag? What I can see is making that line. I might then go and look up what is an HR and try and figure out how to use this. I'm just right and clicking on this to see if it has any way of going to the docs, and it doesn't. Also, bear in mind that I can change this. I can manipulate the DOM, which might be useful if we wanted to test what this looks like with bigger text in it. We could do that in the DOM here directly without having to go away and change things in the application. If we knew a feature was coming in and it was for some reason going to change the DOM layout, I could do that in here. I can just drag things and move them about. We can manipulate the DOM. It doesn't matter, by the way, because we just refresh the page, it reloads it, and everything is the same. So this is quite important. If I want to manipulate the application, then I'll use the elements view. Let's take a particular example. Let's say I'm going to, let's go into books, view as a table. I'll amend this. So now I have a form. I have an HTML form in here. Now, typically, if you don't have any development tools, you're just going to be testing the form. You're just going to be typing in values, updating, seeing what happens. With the element view in here, let's click this to inspect that particular element. I can see that this has some validation on it. This pattern attribute means that if I try and empty this and hit update, we get some validation and it won't submit the form. And I can see that this is HTML based validation. The browser is doing the validation. We didn't code anything special to do this because the browser is doing it. It's important to know when the HTML is doing some validation versus when we've coded some JavaScript to do validation, because we don't have to test it as much when it's using HTML. This will be consistent across any browser that supports the pattern attribute for text attributes. And if I needed to, I could use caniuse.com to see if that setting is supported on the different browsers. So that was the pattern attribute. Can I use pattern attribute for input fields, and it tells me which browser are compatible, which are not, which have issues. So that's quite handy if I'm trying to figure out, do I need to do any cross-browser testing, because we have just introduced this pattern attribute in our code. If I want to, I can remove this. Let's remove this entire pattern attribute. And now there'll be no validation there, and I can, oh, it says required. Let's get rid of required. So now there'll be no validation on that input field, and I can submit it. But I can see that the server has done some validation. So I've bypassed the GUI validation, and we've now got server-side validation coming into play. So I was able to test that without having to go down to an HTTP level. So we can manipulate the browser here to test conditions that might otherwise be quite hard. It's also important to know what these elements are, so we can see what is HTML and which ones that we have left untouched. Have any of these got any JavaScript on it? Well, let's have a look. If I go into the event listeners and choose an element, this does not have any event listeners doing any validation or on change. I don't think any of these do, actually. So there's nothing special in here. This is a pure HTML form, but the event listeners tab is very useful for identifying, have we written any code, in which case we might want to test that particular feature in more detail. We can also use this to learn a bit more about CSS. CSS is very important because it controls the layout. this is a drop-down menu. Is this drop-down menu using JavaScript or is it using CSS? You might have to ask someone, or you could simply inspect the element here, and it looks to me like this is pure CSS. So if I hover this particular element, let's put it on this list item, hover, and there we go. So I can use this DevTools to help me test the drop-down menu more. I can put it into a hover state. I can see what it looks like when it's been visited if it's a link. I can see what it's like if it's active or inactive to see what styling is in place. And this one basically just has hover effect or non-hover effect. So it's not using JavaScript, so I don't have to do an extensive amount of testing here because there's no risk of JavaScript errors using the menu. But I just have to be aware that it's using CSS. It's not using CSS in a complicated way, so there's less likely to be some cross-browser issues there. But I can see now whether it's using JavaScript or CSS for certain controls, and I might want to test them in more detail. Similarly with the hamburger menu that comes in play, is that CSS or is that... so that's a nav item, hover. So that's basically just using CSS, it's not using JavaScript. Good to know. We're exploring the application to figure out what capabilities it's got and where we need to spend time doing testing. So this is the DOM view. It shows us what the document object model is, and we can manipulate it, change it in different ways. Console. The console shows us any JavaScript issues and any other warnings or issues that come into play. So this is telling me there's a badge request. So that's a result of us having tried to submit this with a invalid value that the server has rejected. We can see that we did a put request and we got an error message back. So the console is useful for showing us warnings. It's also very useful for letting us type in any JavaScript. If we know JavaScript, we can write custom JavaScript in here. I'm not going to do that. That's a different video. It's worth having the console up when you're testing an application that's using JavaScript, because this will help you spot errors that you might not otherwise notice. They might not appear on the main view, but they will appear in here if you've got JavaScript issues. The recorder's new. The recorder is a new bit of functionality that let's test this. I haven't used this. I mean, you can see that I've tried to. Let me delete. So what it lets us do is we can measure performance across network. We can record little scripts in here, potentially replay them back. So if I want to run, let's start a new recording. Search for doc and start recording. So I'm going to search for doc and click search, and it's given me a book title back. End recording. So now I have a script here. So I could replay this. Let's replay this. Hey, and it replayed it. I haven't got any assertions in here, so that's not very good for me in terms of an execution that will report back if something goes wrong, so I have to watch it. However, if you are new to automated execution, you don't know how to code, you can export this as a Puppeteer script and then start experimenting with automated execution using Puppeteer if you want to. This is still very much a new feature, so it will expand over time and may eventually become useful. The performance panel shows us how it was working during that script. If we spent more time here, that might be quite useful to understand it and see the performance, because really it's taken us forward in the tabs over to the performance insights, but it's shown us the performance insights of running a repeated action, which is probably what it's good for at the moment. Later on, it may be useful for building automated execution scripts. So let's jump back to the network tab. So the two most used tabs for me are the elements tab, which lets me work with the DOM, and the network tab. Because with the network tab, I can see what the application is doing under the covers and how it's communicating with the server. If I click on home, we'll go back to home and I can see it made a GET request to particular URL, then brought in the JavaScript APIs, and CSS. So I can see how the page is built up. Similarly, if I go to books. Now, what's happening here is as I move between pages, I'm losing the information about the previous requests. I can fix that by putting on preserve log. I usually have preserve log on because then I can basically keep track of where I've been, and the most recent requests are further down. But if I'm interested, I can go back and see how I got here. I find that very useful. When I'm testing, I'll typically have disable cache set, which means that it won't cache any of the requests. If you want to see what it's like in a real browser, you might have that off, then it won't keep loading in the JavaScript files all the time, and you'll start to see more of just the immediate requests that are put through. What I like about the network tab is that I can understand better how the application is working. So let me clear this for the moment, refresh this. I've got a search page. When I do a actual search here, what happens? Well, this network tab is telling me that it did a fetch. It didn't do a document request, which is loading, which would mean it was submitting through a form. This tells me that JavaScript was involved. And I can see that up here if I filter for what requests is JavaScript making. This JS is what JavaScript files have been brought in, what CSS files have been brought in, are there any images? That's what these filters are for. But this one is showing me what requests were made by JavaScript in the application. It's useful to understand what is a simple form request and what is a JavaScript request, because we might want to test the JavaScript request in more detail because there's going to be more code, more complex functionality behind it. If I click on a request, I can then see how that request operates. And again, this is a great way to learn HTTP. If you see anything you don't understand, then go and look it up. But we can see what the request that's been sent. And I can view this as a raw request to get a feel for how HTTP works. And I can see the response. If I want to just see the response in here, then I can see that when I did a search for test, a JSON object came back. And it's got an attribute data, which is an object, then there's an array, which is empty. So so nothing has come back from the server. And I can see that the graphical user interface is saying no results found. So it's interpreting that empty array and saying no results found. So if I put in doc, which we did before, then hopefully when that search is there, format that, pretty print it, I can see the details of what was sent, and I can see all the details that were sent, not just the details that the application has chosen to render. This can be useful in terms of, is the application bleeding data? Is it giving me more information than I need? What else does this suggest that I might want to test? More information is useful because it feeds into our testing and gives us a better model of what's going on. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but you can see here there's a history of test searches on the screen. During this test session, I've only done 2 searches, so where have all the rest come from? It's important to try and understand how is this application working. And I know that this means it's using some sort of storage, and we'll see that later on in the DevTools. We can see how this bit of information is being populated. The network tab, very useful. What we can also do is there's a whole bunch of options in here. If I wanted to, I could save all the requests that I've made as a HAR file, which is an HTTP archive file, which you could then open in another tool like Zap Proxy, but you're creating a record of the responses that you put out. So if you wanted to create a test session and you found something and you want to review it later, save it as a HAR file and you can view it in other tools. There are online tools for viewing HAR files if you want to. What can also be useful is, say I did a search that found a bug. This one hasn't found a bug, but say I did one that found a bug. I could take a screenshot, I could copy the request, but I can also copy the request as a curl command, which would then mean, if I get a browser up, this is curl, which is a command line utility for making HTTP requests. I could paste this into a defect report, and then the developer could recreate this defect by reissuing this request, or at least looking at the request and seeing if there's any issues. They might spot something in the request that makes sense to them than made sense to me. And you can see also here that we're testing on a Mac with a particular OS version. We're no longer got the same headers that we put through when we were working with the device toolbar. Back to the browser requests. Okay, so sources shows us all the files that have been loaded in. If I go into page, I can see all the files in the handy folders, so I can see the raw JavaScript, I can see all the content. Now, what's interesting here is we may not have realized that the application allows us to have multiple versions, but there's a clue here that it's bringing in files from version 10, version 9, version 3. So seeing this information, I can then go, why is it doing that? And I can see that the application allows me to switch back to older versions of the application, which work in slightly different ways. So one of these, so you can see there's extra functionality in here. But the clue for me learning that was in the files that were passed through here. The more we can observe about the application, the more we can interrogate it, the more we will learn, and the more we understand what testing we might do. So this is mainly used for viewing files. However, there is also a snippets view here, which is basically a mini JavaScript editor that allows us to write JavaScript code that when we run it will run against the browser. I don't think I have any Pulper JavaScript in there, but this is a good way for me to experiment with automated execution and control the application. You need to know JavaScript in order to use this, but it's worth understanding that it's there. Performance insights, we saw already. This is quite a complicated view, but it lets us record how the application is working. We can see where it spends time rendering, what it's doing. Performance view again lets us record the application when it's running and see how much memory it's taking up, things like that. The memory view lets us look at the memory that's in place and record it over time, so we can zoom in and see what is in the system's memory. I don't use these very much, which is why I'm talking about them in quite vague terms. I have used them a little bit, but not enough to be able to demonstrate it or give you any good reasons. Sometimes this can be useful just to see what kind of content is being stored in memory, but I really don't use it very much. Then we've got the secret menu here. What I tend to use here is in the application. Now, previously we had a history of searches. Test. We can see all the searches that we've made here. The storage section will show me how that is being stored. Session storage shows me anything that's been stored for this session, which means it will go away when the browser is closed. Since this was here when the browser opened, it clearly isn't in session storage. Cookies can be retained for a long period of time, but here we've just got an API cookie and some session cookies, so it's not going to be that. In local storage, I can see that there's a search history key and it's got different values in here. So I can also edit this. So now if I do a search, it will tell me that previously I've searched for doc2. So this can be useful because we are changing historic information or information that the browser has stored, and it is using it. Any user can do this. We could change cookies, and if there's a user ID here, we could change it. Perhaps we'll get to log in as someone else. Understanding what information the application is storing, then manipulating it, can help us put the application into different states. The security view can give you some basic checks on the application. It's not a proper security audit, but it gives you some information that is kind of available in here. The Lighthouse is very useful. We can generate different reports on its accessibility, whether it's good for SEO, whether there's any real issues with the web page. So let's try and see what happens. It's not a big page, so it probably won't tell us very much, but I've used this to pick up issues on live sites as a quick overview analysis of the application to see where it's spending more time. Great. So it's given me some rough indicators. There's some screenshots. It's given me some potential issues in the HTML. It's not the same as doing an HTML static analysis, but it gives you some useful information. And again, this is useful for trying to understand aspects of the web that we may not. We may not know anything about accessibility. So it's telling me that the HTML element does not have a lang attribute. I don't know what that is. I'm going to have to look it up. How does that impact accessibility? It can show me what it's looked at. Then I can go, I don't know what this means. In order to test other applications, this might be important. So again, all this information is not something that we report. It's something that we have to investigate to understand to determine whether it's something that we should report. This might be a useful indicator of a potential cross-browser issue. So I would have to look at this in more detail to see if it actually was. But again, once you get your head around this, it's a very useful basic tool, but always remember that this is being done on your machine. And if you've got a fast machine, it's not necessarily representative of your users. And Google does provide tools online that will give you a more usable or a more representative example of the kind of functionality and performance that your users are going to experience. And that's pretty much it. There are more features and functionality in here, but that tends to be what I mainly use. Scanning across the top, using Lighthouse, using the application storage, using network, using elements, writing snippets, looking at the JavaScript source code, using the console to monitor for error messages, and doing some basic responsive layout testing and potentially some mobile testing in terms of the headers. Get your head around that and you'll have a really good basis for interacting with web applications. You'll see things that you don't understand, which is a good basis to then go and research and do some investigation. But I spend a lot of time in the Elements view interacting with the HTML, looking for potential issues, trying to narrow down my testing by looking at where the JavaScript has been enabled, understanding the JavaScript, bypassing validation, putting information into the system that it's not supposed to do, and seeing how the server reacts. There's a huge number of capabilities that open up once you start understanding this. So hopefully this video has given you some indication of the possibilities and encourages you to look at this more. But this is just the Chrome video and it's September 2022, so this may change over time. But the easiest way to learn is to start the browser, inspect, open the DevTools and start working through these tabs and trying to make sense of it. So if you find this video useful, remember to subscribe and I'll see you in future videos. And you might want to pop over to EvilTester.com and see what is going on in the blog.